Hey there, folks. Welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And I think the lesson to take from this past week, at least for me, is that expectations did not help in any direction. Some albums they overachieved, some did the exact opposite, and some wound up exactly what I expected, but didn't give me much more to say or work with, so I kind of wound up disappointed as a result. Well, strap in. It's gonna be another long one. This is On the Pulse. So we got 10 albums on the docket. Let's first go back and talk about, from Thomas Rhett, Country Again, Side A.
And as I reeled him in, I thought, man, it feels good to be country again.
I could be really snarky about this album, starting off with the question of whether or not Thomas Rhett was ever making the sort of neo-traditional material for which he's aspiring now, instead of flitting between pop country, bro country, and the offense to human dignity that was tangled up. But if Thomas Rhett was using this opportunity to make something that's a little bit more organic warmth and had some more diverse songwriting, I wasn't against the idea in principle. He's got that potential. And now months later, talking about it, well, to be very blunt, it sounds a lot less like Luke Combs and more like Thomas Rhett adding the faintest dash of neo-traditional sounds to his pop-leaning music, which does, on average, make it a bit better, but not nearly as interesting as it could be. And that's a little bit surprising for me here, believe it or not. Thomas Rhett's father, Rhett Atkins, was an artist who was active in the mid-90s. He knows what this sound is. It's how Thomas Rhett got his start in Nashville. But this return to roots, it's not especially convincing when the other artist he references most frequently is Eric Church, who I might like, but across the majority of his career, I would describe as country adjacent, at best. It's kind of hard to escape the feeling that this return to roots, it's a lot more about the fact that this sound is now rising in popularity in Nashville, rather than something for which Thomas Rhett has a natural affinity. And that makes the attempts to match with his own thinner sound, full of obviously programmed percussion and fake hand claps, just kind of awkward, especially with the super in-front vocal blending that is distractingly inorganic, especially with some of the higher-pitched backing vocals. Honestly, despite being a lot more pop, I would argue 2017's Life Changes feels like the album that is way more authentic to who Thomas Rhett actually is, especially as he already had some of the settled Family Man songs on that project. And it really is the content that feels the most frustrating here, because like on previous albums, it is just way too easy for him to default to list-driven tracks that are not that far removed from his bro country days, and Put It on Ice is pretty much just a bro country song, then just swapping in a few neo-traditional signifiers along the way, with some mildly embarrassing moments like To the Guys That Date My Girls, which at his age and with his vocal timbre, he just can't sell it. And it's frustrating because Heaven Right Now, which I actually reviewed in song form, it's a storytelling moment with more pathos and proves, once again, this guy can make songs with more of an organic narrative punch, and after the success of Marry Me, you would hope he would double down on it, but he never did. And you know what? I'm not going to complain about the pedal steel or how good the fiddle sounds on Blame It on a Backroad or how the harmonica sounds on You Heard, but let's not make this album more than what it actually is. And the snippets where this album shows how it could have been more, I wound up a little disappointed as a result. Light 6 out of 10. Thomas Rhett fans are going to have fun with it, but if you're expecting a smarter or more neo-traditional pivot, you're only going to get traces of it. Hate to say. Next up, from Liz Phair, Soberish.
The ghost I see in the mirror doesn't smile anymore.
Hey kids, you want to have Liz Phair discourse in 2021? Because I sure as hell don't. Exile in Guyville was a transgressive and forward-thinking 90s classic, but it was also a breakthrough where she could never quite recapture the biting, jagged magic ever again. Mostly an issue of the writing being emulated to death to the point of cliche in the next 2 decades, but also because that album feels very specifically time-locked to that acrid moment of early 90s feminist indie rock and punk. Now the problem with her 2000s output and her pop pivot on the self-titled and Somebody's Miracle, It wasn't that they were bad for what they were trying to do, but they've never really stood out from the crowd in the way that her best material did. And while Fun Style certainly stood out, it also alternated between being tedious and, let's be charitable and say, utterly misguided, and I had no clue where an 11-year hiatus would leave Liz Phair, given just how far she was away from her best work. I'll admit, rock bottom expectations. And that might have been the best way to approach this, because while it's nowhere close to her best, this is actually pretty decent, even if you can absolutely tell there's enough misguided clunkiness to the instrumentation to hold it back from being, you know what, somewhat great. I don't know how much of this was due to budget constraints or Liz Phair's lingering and rather questionable fondness for synthetic elements that she has never been able to integrate all that well. I imagine it might be some of the latter because she brought back Brad Wood, the original producer who worked on Exile on Guyville back in the 90s, and who has actually had a storied run ever since for decades now, his biggest standout in recent years being his work on Stage 4 by Touche Amore, but a lot of the touches of gauzy, warbling synth, a lot of underweight drum machines, and some really questionable synthetic vocal layering, they don't do anyone any favors, especially against all the ramshackle acoustics and the touches of jagged electric guitar here. And it leaves the feeling of Liz Phair trying to strike that perfect balance between her indie roots and a much more of a poppier side for which she's still very comfortable. And sure, the majority of the audiences have actually caught up with her and then caught up to accepting it, but the integration feels more beholden to an awkward quirkiness of hers rather than flattering all of the songs, which is also very true of a lot of her writing, where she still has a taste for a lot of jokes that might be more funny to her than anybody else. But you know what? I'm also inclined to be a little charitable here because A, this has been true for decades with Liz Phair, B, it's more of a stylistic choice rather than a failing, and it's absolutely a matter of taste because I know this brand of intentional weirdness will work for some people, and C, I might be one of those people, because the rest of the compositions and writing are actually pretty damn good. Not kidding about that either. The one benefit to Liz Phair keeping a lot of her pop instincts is that she's got some of her best hooks since the self-titled album, and this time she effectively marries it with a lot of the lived-in maturity in her writing that's always had a ton of wry charm for me. It reminds me a lot of Alanis Morissette's criminally overlooked album from last year, in that Liz Phair has nothing left to prove at her age, and that gives her a lot more flexibility as she sketches out the complicated stories that come with existential angst, relationships that are imploding, a lot of substance abuse, and the ramshackle human ugliness, where her remarkably even-handed framing that has always been her strongest asset ever since the very beginning, where a lot of the guys might still be dicks, but she observes a lot more dimensions to their dickery even as she holds up the sharpest mirror to herself, be it imagining a commiseration with Lou Reed, or the sardonic exit of Good Side, or the deflective angst and the stumbling attempts at moderation on the title track and Dosage. And outside the album probably running a little bit shy on momentum by the very end, yeah, you know what? I'm surprised, but I enjoyed this a decent bit. 7 out of 10. Maybe he's got the benefit of low expectations, but I had fun with this. And if this is the Liz Phair that we've got back, man, happy to have her. Next up from Left at London, There Is a Place for You Here.
Mother and father, two little sisters, all were immigrants. America was waiting for you. America was waiting for you.
So when I covered Left at London last year, it was one of those cases where I quite liked a lot of what I had heard, but I was also very much aware of how hit and miss it could feel in the choice of tones and production, which meant that with maybe a little more time and refinement, I was probably going to have a lot more luck finding something I would like. What we got instead was a project that t.i.a.p.f.y.h created in 2 months, as a part of an artist residency program, where a lot more rough edges were left in along the way in the process of getting a workable album released. And you know, I'll say it, there is a part of me that would accept some of this regardless. Thematically, this is a project exploring the messy and very deeply complicated hell that comes with battling mental illness, a lot of substance abuse, and suicidal ideation, where it feels like both people and just coping mechanisms, they are not working and bringing everything together, where the album's creation process feels just as harrowing in order to drive towards some vestige of overall relief. As such, when it gets very raw raw and uncomfortably bleak, it's part of the point, where creating the album, again, is as much of its own reward, where even if she acknowledges that it might not mean all that much on a greater scale in the end to be then commodified, there is a raw moment of triumph to claw toward the end and still be breathing. Even if she might not want to live, she does not want to miss some of these moments, which wind up being their own reward. Just kind of a shame that the production is a real mess. Yes, I get it. She had a lot of limited time, and that some of the mess, it's at least part of the point, but rough around the edges, it does not have to translate to some painfully underweight and really inconsistent bass mixing. A lot of breakbeat-esque trap drums and vocals that will clip the mix even before all the pitch shifting comes in, and some electric guitars that are way more undercooked fuzz than actual fire. And it's kind of a shame because the melodies here are more robust. They're more theatrical than ever, with a shining high point coming very early on with the Ballad of Marion Zioncheck, which tells the story of a labor lawyer and then congressman from the 1930s who likely committed suicide as a result of mental illness, in a time where such systems were just not equipped in order to handle it, and in some cases they're not that far removed from today and really need a lot more revision. And I almost wish that t.i.a.p.f.y.h had doubled down on some of that storytelling. But the production does remind me of the frustrating shortcomings that you often get with off-Broadway albums in this sort of vein. You appreciate the rawness, the writing, the attempts at grandeur, but too often it feels kind of restrained from exploding as much as it really could. Oh look, I don't know. There's always been a certain ramshackle side to Left at London that I would describe as extremely hit and miss, especially for me, and this is probably the roughest that it's ever sounded to date. And you know what, I probably include some of the increasingly scattered writing in that qualifier, but I will say it, there are starker high points, and there is a raw potency I can't deny. And when that polish does materialize in the compositions, it really shines. And with a thankfully pretty restrained runtime, light 7 out of 10. Definitely a very acquired taste, but one that despite all odds, I think I might wind up defending. Good stuff. Next up from Wolf Alice, Blue Weekend. I mean, on some level you can give them credit for beating everyone to the sound, but this is now the third time I've reviewed Wolf Alice on this channel, and their branded 90s revivalism, which I found underwhelming in 2015, slightly more workable in 2017, courtesy of a change in producers, but as a whole band, they're way too beholden to the collision of influence to produce songs with a lot of impact for me, especially given that I have never been all that impressed by Ellie Rosell's vocals or her hooks. And you know what? I went back to both the last albums before this review. If anything, I'm left feeling there's even less on the two of them. Well, this time, they swapped out producers yet again for Marcus Stroves, who's most well known for a lot of his work with Arcade Fire, Coldplay, early Mumford & Sons, that one Florence and the Machine album, and Hozier's second album, and thus... well, it's tricky. I said before that Wolf Alice, again, is an act that's way too beholden to their influences, and more than ever, even as this album tries to keep going bigger for more theatrical bombast and some of their best hooks, it can become really glaringly obvious when and where they're pulling from for certain sections of alt-rock from the 90s and 2000s. And for those of us who grew up with that era or know it very well, simply pumping the sound up on steroids with reverb and some oddly bass-heavy, unbalanced mixes doesn't always obscure the fact that on a compositional level, some of these tracks can feel really underwhelming melodically, which in Wolf Alice tradition, it's mostly courtesy of some really underpowered guitars that when they have any loudness, again, more fuzz than fire. Now I'll admit, some of this is me again cracking down on all the retro fetishism, but with Wolf Alice, it is a little bit different, mostly because this has always been a band that has relied way more on production texture and the vibes than actual hooks. So while I appreciate a little bit more variety in their sound, it certainly sounds like Wolf Alice's most expensive album to date, especially in these arrangements, it does not get away from the underlying problems that this time around will be ignored by way too many people on sheer cinematic bigness of the sound. To make a very late 90s and yet appropriate reference, look at the history of projects like Be Here Now for the depressing trend of third albums that equate scale scale with quality. But another part of it is, again, Ellie Rossell's vocals. I've never thought she was a gripping or interesting presence given where she's placed in the mix, and while the heavier overdubs definitely help more here, whenever she bends her tone to sound more like her influences, it doesn't help her stick out. Whoever told her that rapping was a good idea or that it fits with anything here, they were wrong to a criminal extent. Even if it might have been a thing in certain stripes of late 90s alternative rock, doesn't mean it was a good idea then, or that she needed to replicate it now. Now, this would be the area where a lot of great writing would potentially set this above. It did kind of help their second album, but again, it's really spotty here. Do I like the jaded LA ennui of Delicious Things because it captures that glamorous depression effectively, or because it's one of the best songs that Lana Del Rey never cut and I wouldn't mind hearing her cover? Do I like Safe from Heartbreak If You Never Fall in Love because of its ironic juxtaposition with jaunty 60s inspired folk, or because it's actually kind of poignant in its sentiments? Do these back and forth cycles of these relationships coax through depression and melodrama? Do they have enough distinctive flavor to ride out on ironic stylism? Or does it all just feel so underweight like so much of the 90s detachment could, even at its worst moments in that era? Because I'll hold them to account too. The frustrating thing is that by the end, with the breakup and the moment of healing with all the girls, I get on paper a lot of the pathos that they're trying to capture, but at its core, this still winds up feeling way more thin and derivative than it really should, even at its best moments. Again, I don't think it's precisely bad as a result. In fact, this album probably has some of Wolf Alice's best moments. Arguably, it's their most memorable project to date, and that's gotta mean something, but I'm not sure it's memorable for all the right reasons, which is why it's a 6 out of 10 and only a slight recommendation from me. If you haven't heard these tones before, it might serve as a good introduction, but if you have, this might not impress you all that much. Just saying. Next up from Slayyyter, Troubled Paradise. I'll admit there was a part of me that was kind of curious about Slayyyter. Take the modern, plastic, but forward-thinking flair of hyperpop, but clean up some of the mixing issues, refine the hooks, make it a little bit more palatable to an audience that's not always on board with the sound, which I'll admit includes me on occasion, and yet her 2019 mixtape didn't quite always get there for me. The comparison I saw a lot was Britney Spears by way of bubblegum bass and hyperpop, but it also reminded me of the era where Britney Spears' production was very overworked and mechanical and didn't always flatter the hooks, and the shallow materialism of the content, it remains that one part of hyperpop on the mixtape that never really gelled for me, even if they are attempting to approach it more ironically. But now for a full-length album, well, okay. One of the underlying gimmicks to a lot of Slayyyter's sound is that she aims to strike a balance between making all of the implied sexual subtext of early 2000s pop outright in-your-face text, along with more raw and confessional moments, make it all too much all the time. But what seems to have gone missed is that when the pop divas of that era had gold, it came courtesy of killer melodic hooks to back up all the slick grooves. And if there's something that really holds back Troubled Paradise, it's just how undercooked it can feel melodically in that department. Don't get me wrong, it's got that same overproduced sultriness, and really a lot of the punch and the percussion you would expect from hyperpop, but it's extremely low on subtlety or innovation in comparison with a lot of the scene. And without a stronger sense of tune, at least on a musical level, it doesn't seem to show off a lot of variation, and that does kind of make it run together. Kind of a shame, because when you actually shift towards the content, there's a little bit more nuance than Slayyyter will likely get credit for in between the lines here. For one, you can really tell that a lot of the raunchier elements are just as much of an empowering escape than anything for her. Maybe even therapeutic, because on some of the slower moments of melancholy reflection on exes, she realizes on songs like Clouds that despite reaching unexpected heights in her career of this sort of success, she's not really all that happy. So when Slayyyter embraces her fantasies with more graphic detail, she's no villain so much as someone who is finding and claiming their own sense of release, in the same territory as Britney or especially Kesha did in this era. So again, even if this brand of hyperpop isn't quite for me tonally, Charli XCX is still probably in the lead in that department, there is a part of me that does respect this for both songs like Clouds and Villains, as well as tracks like Throatzilla and Cowboys. I mean, it's good to have both, and she does have that versatility. So, solid 6 out of 10. Not bad at all. Next up, from KennyHoopla and Travis Barker, Survivor's Guilt, the mixtape. Alright, easy joke about Travis Barker being on everything aside, KennyHoopla has been a name that I've really wanted to look into for a while now. His breakthrough EP dropped last year. It was a glossy fusion of early Block Party-esque post-punk and modern emo rap. And while there might be some parallels in vocal delivery, content, and sheer commitment to the expansive vibe to that last Trippie Redd album that also, what do you know, had Travis Barker all over it, KennyHoopla had a level of refinement in the composition and the production that made me very intensely curious where the hell he was gonna go with this tape. And well, you can certainly hear Travis Barker's influence in the incredibly crisp and compressed drum work and a lot of the mixing. Not quite a full pop-punk pivot, but if you were a fan of that smoky post-punk atmosphere, there's a lot less of it this time. And I'm not convinced that's a good thing. Maybe it's just me, but it has that feel of pushing KennyHoopla to a much more accessible lane. At least until he tries a lot of sharper screaming and even some growls, and not only do they sound pretty bad and pretty unconvincing, the mix has nowhere near the guitar energy or crunch or coursing groove to support him well there, which frustratingly, it was also a very similar issue to what happened with Trippie Redd on that last project. Only now, it's in the service of making an artist sound significantly less interesting. There's a unique sound here, why didn't you double down? Maybe if the bass lines had any presence, or if Travis Barker could harness that twisted alchemy that managed to coalesce around Machine Gun Kelly for once, because I would argue some of the hooks here, they are just as good, and silence is also an answer. It's probably the closest thing in order to capturing some of that 2020 sound. I might be more supportive of this, but you know what, in between the abbreviated runtime at 20 minutes, where how the content feels a lot more basic as well, and a lot of the clinging relationship angst or the I hate LA sentiments, although there are some fragments of some darker ideas along Survivor's Guilt, and I actually like the more goofy side of the melodrama that's coming on Smoke Break. I don't know, I'm left feeling that this feels a lot more like Travis Barker's project, and it's not better for it. Let's just keep it as a mixtape, and I really do hope that KennyHoopla can get back into his regular sound, and sooner rather than later. 6 out of 10. I really wanted this to be better. Next up from Sleater-Kinney, Path of Wellness.
Music like fools. We cannot hear the chimes when it rings midnight. We can't imagine what we will lose.
You know, I was one of those people who defended that last Sleater-Kinney album, the last that Janet Weiss blazed on before a messy exit from the band, and probably one that reflected as much of St. Vincent's influence as their own. But even then, if I was being honest, I could have heard some of those cracks forming, and that definitely had me worried about their new project right here, which was self-produced, the first time since co-producing their early 90s debut. And yeah, if it feels like there are some things that are missing, it's exactly what you think they might be. Not saying the session drummers here are bad, they're not, but their playing is nothing all that special, and given how underwhelming and really inconsistent a lot of the drum progressions and the fills are, you can tell that the duo were just not all that interested in giving the percussion a lot of cracking presence to drive things, or really giving the album much punch as a whole. Normally on a Sleater-Kinney album, there is some greater sense of urgency. I understand why I care, but with the bass lines feeling increasingly formless, but also very leaden and overemphasized, and the electric guitar having a lot more fuzz and squeal than actual muscle opposite all the goopy keyboards, you can really tell just how much they are missing production to make these hooks really pop. Or you know what, maybe it's an issue of tempo. This is the most languid that Sleater-Kinney has ever sounded, even on their indie rock side before their hiatus. A lot closer to mid-2010s Lydia Loveless and mid-tempo alternative or indie rock, albeit with nothing close to her hooks or with any of the vocals punching up any of this. And you know what, I guess it's understandable. Punks get older, they slow down, I'm not surprised. But normally they do that to accentuate the lyrics or the atmosphere. And with the production so uninspired and the composition so listless, the writing, also feels really underwhelming. And beyond how the lyrics feel a fair bit more basic and ham-fisted in their poetry all around this time, I can pinpoint exactly what's missing. The tension. The best Sleater-Kinney songs, they were wound things up so tightly that the catharsis of actual release produced so much exhilaration, whereas this album never comes close. The title track highlights how they're both on a path of wellness. Left unspoken is that those who are pestering them aren't on that path. Whereas even the love songs, they feel like they're almost held at a distance. And sure, no knives, complex female characters, they're all about that subversion of a lot of unfair expectations on women that they're gonna give you any of this intensity. But it also becomes meta text, trying to justify making the album less interesting for everyone. And it's kind of a toothless deconstruction when the album will then swing around and try to make you care about a lot of their healing process in the face of the pandemic, or the violence in Portland, whereby the final song they want to go to the love will bring us together message that feels depressingly naive for a band that came out of Riot Girl, for God's sakes. But the line that is most revealing to me is on Down the Line. It's not the summer we were promised, it's the summer we deserved, which in the wake of last year, and especially the exit of Janet Weiss, just feels so self-centered and detached from reality. And I gotta be honest, it's a little gross, especially with the reality that COVID-19 meant for a lot of people. So yeah, I guess I can respect the mood of giving us nothing, but the flip side of that is I have no reason to care. 5 out of 10, comfortably their worst and most boring album to date. Skip it. Next up from Marina, Ancient Dreams in a Modern Land.
Be motherfucking crazy. Nothing in this world could change me.
Okay, so after listening to this album, especially after how downbeat and forgettable Marina's last project was, you know what, I want to describe my experience, because it was something. Keep in mind, I still hold The Family Jewels as one of the best pop records of the 2010s, very nearly so. So to hear her back pushing towards a more upbeat, colorful brand of theatrical electro rock with some of the sharpest hooks that she's had since Fruit, that was an immediate, very pleasant surprise. And you know, it kind of makes sense. It's more of a return to her roots, especially as she had a much stronger hand on the songwriting and production this time around. And considering mainstream pop producers have always kind of really struggled to flatter her unique throatier voice and her sense of theatricality, to hear this pivot, legit exciting. And it's got some of her best hooks and most consistent production, probably to date, especially on the piano ballads, where she can flex more of that theater girl side, for which I might have a bit of a weakness, if that's not flagrantly obvious. So, okay, return to the bombast and a lot of the flair that made The Family Jewels so incredible. Obviously, this is the pop surprise of 2021, right? Well, this is where we have to go to the writing and the lyrics. And you know what? Let me start by saying that she specifically intended to get a fair bit more political and socially conscious on the album. She said that in interviews. Give her material a different sort of edge than what you would normally see in this sort of mainstream adjacent pop. And she doesn't hold back on songs like Man's World and Purge the Poison and New America, the last of which is kind of weird because, again, she is Welsh and there's no shortage of analogous topics in the UK she could have referenced. But you know what, to be clear, for the most part, the whole eco-feminist, left-leaning material, that's my wheelhouse. I didn't even mind some of the bluntness all that much if she wants to be political. But if I'm going through my 3 Ps of good political art, it might have the power, it might have some of the populism, but it's not exactly precise or well executed with a lot of nuance. If you're going to complain about capitalism, maybe don't brag about being a millionairess on Venus Flytrap, especially if that song is the best banger you have on the entire album. The comparison I've seen made is that it's very 2014 Tumblr, where you can respect a lot of the exuberance, but it can come across as very try-hard or lacking nuance, which is all the more frustrating when she goes to the more straightforward, less political ballad material and the relationship melodrama. It's considerably better executed. And look, I know how that might come across from me, so let me stress this. It's easily her best album since The Family Jewels. On sound and delivery alone, it is legit pretty great. I'll actually defend some of the slower moments that have seemed to lose people by the end of the album, because I would argue both Flowers and Goodbye are terrific closing tracks. And again, I like this political direction, and even the and elegant moments, they don't detract from me enough to give this a less than a light 8 out of 10, but a little bit more refinement in the details could have made this on par with her best. Frankly, I'm just happy that we got it. She's back on the right path too. If you haven't heard it, give her a chance. This is good. Next up from Emotional Oranges, the Juicebox.
Break it down, down, down. Play it out if you let me. Are you down, down, down?
So those of you who remember the EPs I reviewed back in 2019, right, remember how I thought Emotional Oranges made some of the sharpest and most emotionally layered R&B I have heard in recent years. Hell, I would argue the Juice Volume 1, it's one of the best projects of the 2010s. Certainly one of the most underrated. I think a lot of people in R&B really should give it a lot of attention. But after seeing them kill it live, this was one of my most hotly anticipated projects of this year. Yeah, it might be overstuffed with guest features, but maybe that might add more lyrical dimensionality to their storytelling. And that was always their greatest secret weapon. And well, there's a reason this is showing up in On the Pulse instead of in a solo review where I can shout their praises, cause I can't say I'm nearly as impressed with this as I want to be, especially in comparison with their star-making breakthrough EPs. See, one of my big issues that some have cited with the duo is that their faceless nature doesn't really help their material punch out as strongly as it really could. It seems like it's lacking a little personality, or it can be done by anyone. And while I would argue the writing and the slinky grooves often made up for it in spades and proved that they had more personality if you paid attention, when the duo is playing host to a guest star on every single track, it's hard not to feel like the duo is playing host to everyone, providing a foundation where everyone can play with their formula, but not elevate Emotional Oranges to a higher level. Maybe it's the very summery, tropical feel around a lot of the percussion and many of the grooves that still set off some impeccable vibes thanks to the great bass foundation, the supple guitars, and the great chemistry between our duo. Again, exceptionally easy album to enjoy, but even this wasn't really the vibe or the tone they had cultivated across the best moments of the first two Juice EPs. So it kind of places the duo even a little bit outside their own established comfort zone and their slightly darker vibe as well, which doesn't help the complaints of anonymity for them. And it's also not really helped by the content, which is where having a guest star on every single song means you can't really develop an internal arc. And in the case of Vince Staples, I mean, I like the guy, but he just sticks out like a sore thumb on Back and Forth. And the project feels more like a mixtape or a summer sampler rather than engaging with some of the moodier complexity, especially when you realize this is actually shorter than their last two EPs. Now, granted, some of that complexity is there. There's a lot of interplay between the duo, you get all the smoky hookups for all the wrong reasons, but even as the project ends on a bit of a wistful note, it's not like we don't already have corners of my mind here. And overall, you know what? It's lightweight, it's very enjoyable, it's still a high enough level of quality overall to convince me this is pretty great, but only just so. Light 8 out of 10. I'm still looking for that next step to put them really over the top. They're close, but this ain't it. And finally, from Polo G, Hall of Fame.
Another bag, like fuck it, I'ma count while I'm in it. I hear planes flying, crowds screaming, money counting chains, clanking shit. I guess that's how it sound when you win it. I ain't joking, do it sound like I'm kidding.
You know, it's been conspicuous, at least for me, that I haven't covered a lot of the albums on the recent crop of trap and drill artists. I've been waiting until we get the album bombs on Billboard Breakdown, and then I go from there. It tends to work. But with Polo G, I did want to make an exception here. He's arguably one of the better writers that is coming out of the new school of acts. His command of melody has only gotten a lot more refined, and given how he's been expanding and refining a lot of his sound, I did have some hopes that this might show an advancement that was coming off of the GOAT, and what I got instead was a pretty standard Polo G album. Now, this is a problem I have observed a fair number of times with the recent set of upstarts, that there might be a standard of decent quality, especially when it comes to Polo G as a pretty solid rapper with some decent thematic complexity, and showing just how his newfound success in the industry has led to real emotional clashes with the bloody life in the streets that he cannot escape, where he's still suffering losses, but there's not that many transcendent moments that elevate or really vary that formula. Maybe that's why there's so many guest stars here too on this project, in order to vary the guitar-backed mid-tempo trap melancholy with smatterings of piano. Because once you get through the 20 songs on this project, you wind up up remembering more of the guest stars than unique moments from Polo G himself. Unfortunately, that's not always for the better. Yes, the late Pop Smoky delivers a very solid hook, G Herbo actually stepped up surprisingly well, and DaBaby of all people has the most intensity on a verse I have heard in maybe over a year from him. But as I already said on Billboard Breakdown, it's not like Lil Wayne brought his A game, and sadly, neither did Nicki Minaj or Young Thug, who clearly phoned in their verses. And you know, for some ungodly reason, this is another example of where you bring in Rod Wave and he doesn't click with Polo G either. They should be a natural fit. Why does this keep happening? But the larger issue is that with such uniform production of good but not stellar quality, which could also go for a lot of the content and a lot of the hooks as well, which start running together pretty fast, you start getting that very uneasy impression that Polo G's overall ceiling might not be as high as one might hope. He's got a high floor, but not exactly a high ceiling. Yeah, Rap Star is an excellent song, but it's an early high point that's not really matched outside of maybe Party Life with DaBaby. And you can tell that Polo G is struggling to add a little bit more variation. Broken Guitars is a pretty underwhelming Juice WRLD impression. There's a few drill tracks that he cannot quite sell all that well. And yes, I know how that looks coming from the white boy from the city, as he will then reference directly on Toxic and then call those guys out. But I'm not looking for Polo G to go harder. I'm looking for him to go deeper, go into more specifics of the emotional drama, of which his introspection is his greatest strength. More storytelling in the vein of Bloody Canvas, which winds up way too late on the project to make as much impact as it should. Or get into the messy systemic complexities that lead to scenes like his own in the streets. But I also get the feeling that would make a project like this, stuff full of a lot of singles and clearly targeting the stream trolling album bomb on the Hot 100, it would just make it all way too real, not as accessible. And it's kind of a shame that he will not take that next step and push that next boundary. And while I've had a lot of questions about Polo G's management for months now, given the rapid release schedule and his seeming inability to work some singles, it's hard to escape the suspicion that they're pushing him in a more accessible but far less interesting and also career-shortening direction. Because as soon as this sound gets stale, this album's going to feel increasingly bloated and unfocused. And even with that, even though there's enough consistent quality here for me to give this a very light 7 out of 10, I feel like I'm being generous. And if Polo G does not shift things up very soon, even a good standard, even a good high ceiling, it's going to wind up being forgotten. After all, the Hall of Fame, more likely to remember the great moments rather than consistently okay. But yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. I know this went very, very long, and I'm sure I said something controversial, but at this point, I'm not sure I can remember where it was. I'm trying to get through as many reviews as I can before the mid-year. That's coming up in about a week or so, actually just over a week. Please stay tuned for that. But if you want to get involved in getting albums on my schedule ahead of time, link to my Patreon is right over there. Once again, please don't feel obligated, but the option's available. Outside of that, anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. But until then, I'm Mark. You're watching On the Pulse on Spectrum Pulse. And I'll see you next time.